The German gunner's hands remained steady as he aligned the crosshairs on the slow-moving British tank, trudging across the French countryside. May 1940, the Wehrmacht had been cutting through France for 11 days, obliterating everything in its path. Another Allied tank wouldn't change that. He squeezed the trigger. The 37mm armor-piercing round hurtled toward its target at over 760 ms, then it bounced off. Not a penetration, not a failure, just a ricochet. The shell skipped off the tank's hull like a stone skipping across a pond, leaving a bright mark but no damage. The British tank didn't even flinch. It kept moving forward at its painfully slow 11 km/h, the turret slowly turning with mechanical precision toward the German position. The gunner fired again and again. The result was the same. Bright flashes, metallic clangs, shells spinning away into the soil. His loader was feeding rounds faster than ever. Brass casings piled up at their feet. Nothing. The Matilda II, as the British called it, was absorbing everything they threw at it. Its 78mm frontal armor might as well have been made of a strange, otherworldly material for all the good their anti-tank weapons were doing. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Panzer crews had spent the past week and a half mocking British and French tanks. They had knocked out Char-Bs, shredded Somuas, turned small light tanks into flaming wrecks. The Panzer III and WWII had proven themselves the masters of armored warfare. German tactics, training, and engineering were superior. The French campaign had been little more than a victory parade, showcasing modern mechanized warfare executed by professionals. But nobody had warned them about these particular British tanks. Intelligence reports had mentioned the Matilda, but the descriptions were almost dismissive. Slow, undergunned. The British infantry tank idea seemed absurdly outdated. Who would design a tank so slow it could barely outrun a jogger? The name itself sounded like a joke. Matilda, like a plump housewife, not a weapon of war. Some German crews had even nicknamed them cardboard tanks, assuming anything that's slow couldn't possibly be well armored. The gunner's calm was gone. Panic crept into his movements as the Matilda's 2-pounder gun swung in his direction. Around him, other crews were experiencing the same terrifying realization. Their 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank guns, the supposed reliable tank killer of the Wehrmacht, were utterly useless. Completely, utterly useless. They might as well have been throwing rocks. The math was harsh. Their shells could penetrate about 40mm at best, while the Matilda's armor was nearly twice that thick. Simple math, but math that could get you killed. What the German crews didn't know, what nobody outside a few British circles knew, was that they were facing the most heavily armored tank in the world at that moment. Not just thick armor, but precisely designed, well-angled protection that came from years of engineering lessons. The Matilda II's armor wasn't a fluke or an oversight. It was a deliberate design. A tank built specifically to shrug off the kinds of weapons now bouncing harmlessly off its hide. And as this truth spread through the German positions near Arras, something shifted. The invincible Wehrmacht, the unstoppable blitzkrieg, had met its match. To understand how the British ended up with a tank that could laugh at German firepower, we need to look back to November 1918. The Great War had just ended, and military minds across Europe were trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Tanks had made their debut at the Somme in September 1916, clunky, mechanical beasts that terrified German soldiers but broke down almost as often as they broke through enemy lines. By the end of the war, they had proven capable of cracking trench lines, but no one could agree on what they had truly demonstrated. The debate would define the next war. Were tanks meant to be breakthrough weapons, used to exploit gaps and race into the enemy's rear, or were they mobile bunkers, designed to shield infantry as they moved across the killing fields? Two schools of thought emerged, and Britain, somewhat uniquely, decided the answer was both. J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, two of Britain's most influential military thinkers, supported the idea of fast, mobile armored formations. They saw how tanks could restore mobility to warfare, how well-deployed armor could bypass strong points and create chaos in enemy logistics. Fuller's 1919 plan, which was never executed due to the war's end, envisioned a mass of medium tanks driving deep into Germany, disrupting command structures. This thinking eventually led to the creation of the cruiser tank, fast, moderately armored, and built for sweeping maneuvers. But there was another challenge. The infantry still had to advance. They still had to take and hold ground. And when they did, they would face the same machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and field guns that had turned no man's land into a slaughterhouse. What they needed was something that could crawl forward at a walking pace, take hits, and suppress enemy positions while soldiers advanced behind it. Not a cavalry tank, an infantry tank. This wasn't a fringe idea. In 1934, the British War Office issued a call for such a vehicle. The British specifications for their new tank were clear. Protection was paramount. Speed was optional, and range was negotiable. The tank needed to survive concentrated small arms fire, resist anti-tank rifles, and ideally shrug off field artillery. It had to be cost-effective for mass production and simple enough for conscript crews to operate. The British designated it the Infantry Tank Mark, but it became universally known as the Matilda, allegedly named for its resemblance to a waddling cartoon duck from a contemporary comic strip. The Matilda I was rushed into production in 1938 as tensions in Europe escalated. It had impressive armor for its weight, 60 millimeter, but only a single machine gun as its weapon. Still, it proved the concept. When the Matilda II arrived in 1939, British engineers had refined the design. The armor was increased to 78 millimeters on the front. A proper turret with a 2-pounder anti-tank gun was added, and it became a true powerhouse. The cost? A top speed of just 15 mph and significant mechanical complexity. The Matilda II used 2 bus engines because no single engine could reliably move its 27 tons. Meanwhile, Germany had taken a different approach. Their tanks were designed with balanced features, decent armor, reasonable speed, and adequate firepower. The Panzer III had 30 millimeters of frontal armor, and the Panzer IV slightly more. These tanks were designed for maneuver warfare, the combined arms tactics that would define the blitzkrieg. German doctrine didn't envision prolonged battles between heavily armored tanks. Instead, they planned to avoid enemy strength, exploit weakness, and strike so quickly that the defenders wouldn't be able to react. Neither side fully understood what the other had built, and that misunderstanding was about to become costly. The Matilda that rolled off production lines at Vulcan Foundry in Warrington was a compromise that became an unexpected masterpiece. When chief designer John Carden's team at Woolwich Arsenal began their work in 1936, they faced an almost impossible task. They had to create a tank with enough armor to resist every anti-tank weapon then in service, keep it cheap enough for mass production, and ensure it was mobile enough to support infantry. The laws of physics suggested you could only achieve 2 of those 3 goals. But Carden's team managed all 3, though the solution was hardly elegant. The armor scheme was the core of the tank's success. The Matilda II's frontal armor ranged from 75 to 78 millimeters, a remarkable feat in 1939. To put that in perspective, the French B-1 BIS, considered heavily armored, had a maximum of 60 meter, and Germany's heaviest tank, the Panzer IV, only had 30 meters of frontal armor. The Matilda's side armor was 65 to 70 millimeter, and even the rear had 55 millimeters. This wasn't a tank with a strong front and weak sides. It was a moving fortress on tracks. Achieving this level of protection meant accepting serious compromises elsewhere. The hull was cast and riveted in sections, a method that allowed for thick armor but slowed production. Each Matilda took around 16,000 man-hours to build, and at peak production, Vulcan Foundry could manage only 5 tanks per week. In comparison, German factories were churning out dozens of Panzer IIIs monthly. Britain had quality, but Germany had quantity. The power plant solution was almost absurd. No single engine could reliably move the 27 tons of armor at any reasonable speed, so the designers installed two AEC diesel engines originally designed for London buses, running side by side. Each produced 87 horsepower, and together they gave the Matilda a total of 174 horsepower. However, mechanical losses meant the actual output was lower, and the power-to-weight ratio was dismal, only 6.4 horsepower per ton. In contrast, the Panzer III boasted nearly double that. The twin-engine setup made maintenance a nightmare, as mechanics had to service two engines, and if one failed, the tank was immobilized. The 2-pounder gun, which seemed adequate in 1939, fired a 40mm armor-piercing round capable of penetrating 50 to 60mm of armor at combat range, which was effective against the thin-skinned panzers of 1940. It was a solid weapon, but it had its limitations. It lacked a high-explosive round, and British doctrine assumed tanks would primarily engage other tanks, while infantry dealt with anti-tank guns. The Matilda could destroy enemy armor with ease, but it was powerless against entrenched infantry or fortified positions. Crews would soon learn this limitation the hard way. Inside, the cramped, sweltering crew compartment required constant coordination. The commander sat in the turret with the gunner, trying to direct the tank, coordinate with other vehicles, and operate the gun all at once. Below, the driver struggled with the complex Wilson epicyclic gearbox, a robust but difficult system that required precision. The hull gunner, often feeling sidelined due to the limited traverse of his machine gun, mostly served as a second pair of eyes and an extra set of hands for maintenance. The suspension, a scissor-type arrangement with helical springs, was another of Carden's innovations, providing a surprisingly smooth ride despite the tank's heavy weight. 10 small road wheels per side distributed the load effectively, and the track links were made of tough cast manganese steel. This was a critical feature. Many early war tanks had issues with tracks snapping under pressure or coming off in tight turns. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, the Matilda II had become a powerful, if imperfect, tool in the fight. By the time Britain declared war on Germany, only 2 Matilda IIs had been delivered to the army. Production was ramping up, but progress was slow. By May 1940, approximately 100 had been delivered, far fewer than needed to properly equip the armoured divisions, but enough to form the core of the 1st Army Tank Brigade. These 100 Matildas were about to punch far above their weight. They crossed the English Channel into the midst of a catastrophe already in motion. On 10th May 1940, German forces launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. What followed was a masterclass in mobile warfare that shattered every expectation of how modern war should be fought. Guderian's Panzer Corps smashed through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse at Sedan on 13th May, and simply kept going. The French and British had anticipated a repeat of the 1914 war, a grueling attritional fight along fortified lines. Instead, they were faced with a lightning war that moved faster than their command structures could respond. By 20th May, German armoured spearheads had reached the English Channel at Abbeville. In just 10 days, they had driven nearly 400 kilometres through supposedly impassable terrain, splitting the Allied forces and trapping the British Expeditionary Force against the coast. It wasn't just a victory, it was a humiliation. French generals issued orders to divisions already encircled, while British commanders received intelligence reports indicating German positions were already 50 kilometers further west. The speed of the German advance made conventional military thinking obsolete. And the tanks, those dreaded tanks, were everywhere. Panzer divisions didn't attack like traditional armored formations. They bypassed strong points, ignored flanks, and raced straight for key objectives deep behind enemy lines. The French Char B-1 BIS tanks, though individually superior to anything the Germans had, sat defending river crossings while German columns drove past them 15 kilometers away. Superior armor meant little if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. German tank crews had spent the previous weeks systematically destroying Allied armor. learning that while French tanks were formidable, they operated in small groups without adequate infantry or artillery support. British light tanks and cruiser tanks, faster but with thinner armor, could be pierced with even a decent anti-tank rifle. The Panzer III's 37mm gun and the Panzer IV's short 75mm howitzer proved sufficient against everything they encountered. More importantly, German crews fought as a combined arms team. When they met resistance, they didn't charge in alone. They called up infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe support. Tanks were shock weapons, breakthrough tools, but never sacrificial tools. This success bred a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Why wouldn't it? They had achieved in days what the Kaiser's armies couldn't accomplish in 4 years. German tactical radios allowed their tanks to coordinate movements that would have been impossible for the Allies, many of whom still relied on flag signals and carrier pigeons. Every encounter seemed to validate their tactics, training, and equipment. The occasional tough battle, such as the brutal fight at Hanut, where French Sommeurs gave as good as they got, only reinforced the idea that aggressive tactics and combined arms could overcome any disadvantage. By the 3rd week of May, the strategic situation was clear. The BEF was retreating toward Dunkirk, French forces were collapsing, and the campaign was essentially won. German intelligence had detected British tank units in the area, but didn't expect them to pose a serious threat. They'd faced British armor before, light tanks with machine guns, cruiser tanks with thin armor. Nothing that needed special attention. Standard Pak 36 anti-tank guns were sufficient. What German intelligence hadn't accounted for, what they had no reason to expect, was that a significant portion of Britain's Army Tank Brigade was sitting at Arras with something German doctrine hadn't planned for. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments had just received their Matildas only weeks before the invasion. Many crews were still familiarizing themselves with the quirks of their twin-engine tanks, but on 21st May they were going to receive a very practical education. So would the Germans. The counterattack at Arras on 21st May wasn't meant to be a decisive battle. It was intended to be a spoiling attack, just a quick strike to slow the German advance and buy time for evacuation. Major General Harold Franklin commanded 2 columns, one built around the 4th Royal Tank Regiment with 16 Matilda IIs and 42 Matilda IIs, the other around the 7th Royal Tank Regiment with 23 Matilda IIs. Supporting them were 2 infantry battalions, some French light tanks, and little else. There was no proper reconnaissance, no air support. The RAF was already evacuating from forward bases, and no clear understanding of what they were attacking. They were just given orders to strike south from Arras and see what happened. What happened was that they drove straight into Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Rommel had been pushing his division relentlessly, earning his reputation for aggressive leadership. His forces were spread out along the advance. Tanks and motorized infantry mixed with supply trucks and captured French vehicles pressed into service. The division had been moving fast and fighting light, exactly the kind of fluid, mobile warfare that made blitzkrieg successful. Around 14:30 hours, they met the Matildas head-on. Rommel's forces were regrouping west of Arras when British tanks appeared on their flanks. The German response was textbook. Anti-tank gun crews swiftly positioned their Pak 36 and opened fire, followed by confusion and panic. The 37mm rounds were bouncing off the Matildas. Crews that had spent 2 weeks easily destroying Allied tanks now found themselves pounding away at British armor that wouldn't give. One Matilda reportedly took 14 direct hits and kept moving forward. Another absorbed hits from multiple guns at once, shrugging them off while methodically destroying German positions with its 2-pounder gun. Rommel's artillery, the divisional 105mm howitzers, attempted to engage directly. These field guns, designed for indirect fire, were now being used for point-blank anti-tank work. Some crews managed to disable Matildas with lucky hits to tracks or suspension, but it was chaotic, improvised fighting. The German infantry, watching their anti-tank guns fail completely, began to retreat. In some areas, retreat turned into rout. Supply columns abandoned trucks and fled. The 7th Panzer Division's war diary, usually confident, recorded the afternoon as a heavy British tank attack that created a critical situation. The British had punched through the German screen and into the vulnerable logistics tail. Matildas crushed artillery positions, overran supply dumps, and scattered infantry battalions. German crews abandoned their Pak-36s, now deemed useless. They had already started calling them door knockers after previous encounters with the French heavy tanks. The 2-pounder guns on the Matildas, though lacking high explosive rounds, were more than capable of destroying the Panzer II and light vehicles that made up much of Rommel's screen. At one point, elements of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment were 6 kilometers behind the initial German positions, but the attack was too small and unsupported to fully capitalize on the breakthrough. The Matilda, armed only with machine guns, contributed little beyond its armor. The infantry couldn't keep pace with the tanks and got pinned down. French light tanks, meant to protect the British flanks, were separated or knocked out by German fire. Most critically, the British had no follow-up force. This was a raid, not an offensive. As German forces recovered from the initial shock and began to regroup for a coherent defense, the physics of the situation reasserted themselves. Rommel himself took command of every gun that could damage the British tanks. He personally directed 105mm howitzers and even commandeered a battery of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, massive weapons originally designed to take out bombers. These could penetrate the Matilda's armor, though setting up the cumbersome guns under fire cost the crews dearly. By evening, the British were withdrawing, having lost roughly half their tanks to mechanical failures, track damage, or the few heavy German weapons that could harm them. But the damage was done, and it was more psychological than tactical. The Wehrmacht had spent an afternoon watching its standard anti-tank weapons fail completely. The Matildas that surprised Rommel at Arras were just a prelude. The main event came in the Western Desert, where the combination of open terrain, inferior opposition, and concentrated deployment turned the infantry tank into a true nightmare for the Axis forces. When Italy declared war in June 1940, Mussolini's forces in Libya outnumbered the British and Commonwealth troops defending Egypt. Marshal Rulfo Graziani commanded approximately 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The British Western Desert Force, under General Richard O'Connor, had only about 36,000 troops. On paper, it seemed like a massacre waiting to happen. In September, Italian forces cautiously advanced into Egypt, establishing fortified camps at Sidi Barrani. Then they stopped, waiting for supplies and reinforcements. That pause proved fatal. O'Connor planned Operation Compass, originally conceived as a large-scale raid to bloody the Italians and then withdraw. He had roughly 50 Matilda IIs from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. On 9th December 1940, those 50 tanks led the assault on the Italian camps at Nuweiba and Tumar. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of what happens when you bring a knife to a gunfight. But the Italians were the ones armed with knives. Italian anti-tank guns were mainly 47mm Breda models, which were adequate against light armor, but useless against the Matildas. The Italian M1139 and M1340 tanks had armor ranging from 30 to 42mm at best. Their guns could barely scratch the British tanks, while the Matilda's 2-pounders tore through the Italian armor like paper. One Matilda commander reported engaging 17 Italian tanks in succession, destroying every single one without taking any damage. Another Matilda absorbed over 50 anti-tank hits during the battle and still managed to drive away under its own power. The psychological effect on the Italian troops was devastating. When Matildas appeared on the horizon, entire battalions surrendered rather than face them. At Sidi Barrani, 237 Italian tanks were abandoned or destroyed, and over 38,000 Italian soldiers surrendered. What was supposed to be a raid turned into the collapse of Graziani's entire position in Egypt. O'Connor didn't stop there. He kept pushing west into Libya, Bardia fell on 5th January 1941, Tobruk on 22nd January, and at Biederfarm in February, O'Connor's forces, including the resilient Matildas, cut off the retreating Italian 10th Army and forced its complete surrender. In just 2 months, the Western Desert Force advanced 800 kilometers, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, and knocked out or captured over 400 tanks. The losses were significant, roughly 500 dead and 1,400 wounded. It remains one of the most lopsided campaigns in modern military history. At the forefront of it all were the Matildas. Their immunity to Italian anti-tank fire allowed them to advance without fear, suppress defensive positions, and shatter Italian morale just by appearing on the battlefield. Crews grew confident, why wouldn't they? Some even painted nicknames on their tanks, like Cleopatra, Desperate, and Dreadnought. They had earned their swagger. The desert terrain suited the Matilda's limitations. Its slow speed mattered less in open ground, where sightlines stretched for kilometers. The lack of high-explosive ammunition was less critical when the enemy infantry fled at the mere sight of the tanks. But Germany was watching and learning. In February 1941, Rommel arrived in North Africa with explicit orders to study British armor and develop countermeasures. He had already fought Matildas at Arras and knew what the standard German weapons couldn't do. When he deployed the Africa Corps to Libya in March, his supply requests had one thing at the top: 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The 88mm flak gun, while designed to swat aircraft out of the sky at 8,000 meters, was soon found to be perfect for taking out tanks. The Flak 18, as it was known, was arguably the finest anti-aircraft weapon when it entered service in 1933. It could fire an 88mm shell weighing 9 kilograms at a muzzle velocity of 820 ms, giving it a flat trajectory and remarkable accuracy. The heavy shell provided devastating kinetic energy. Against bombers, it was superb. But against tanks, it was overkill. Yet overkill was exactly what was needed against the Matilda. Rommel had learned the hard way at Arras that when standard anti-tank guns failed, the 88mm flak batteries could punch straight through British armor. This lesson stuck with him. When the Africa Corps deployed, Rommel ensured his divisions included substantial 88mm flak assets, ostensibly for air defense, but with ammunition that suggested other intentions. His officers understood immediately. The 88 could engage both aircraft at extreme altitude and tank armor at extreme range. Its versatility made it a devastating weapon. The first major test came during Operation Brevity in May 1941, when British forces attempted to push Rommel back from the Egyptian frontier. At Halfaya Pass, soon to be nicknamed Halfaya Pass, German forces set up their 88s with deadly precision. They positioned the guns in hull-down positions with clear lines of fire, camouflaged them meticulously, and waited. When British Matildas advanced on 15th May, the 88s opened fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Matildas that had been immune to every Italian and German weapon suddenly exploded or ground to a halt. Turrets were blown clean off. Crews who had felt invincible for months now found themselves facing a weapon that could destroy them. The 88mm gun could penetrate roughly 100 meters of armor at 1,000 meters. The Matilda's 78mm armor was no match at that range. British crews reported seeing the flash of the gun and being hit almost simultaneously. The shell velocity was so high there was no time to react. One moment the tank was advancing confidently, the next it was a fireball. The psychological shock was severe. Tank crews, used to their invulnerability, suddenly faced a weapon that rendered their armor useless. However, employing the 88mm as an anti-tank weapon came with significant compromises. The gun was massive, weighing over 5 tons in travel configuration. Setting it up required a crew of 10 and several minutes of vulnerable exposure. Unlike the smaller Pak 36 or Pak 38, which had shields and could be concealed in small depressions, the 88 was enormous and conspicuous. Crews operating these guns in the anti-tank role were exposed and vulnerable. British artillery and infantry could destroy 88 crews if they were spotted before the tanks did. The ammunition situation was another issue. Every 88mm shell used on tanks was one less available for air defense. The supply situation in North Africa was always precarious, with everything needing to cross the Mediterranean under constant Royal Navy and RAF harassment. Rommel was often short of fuel, ammunition and spare parts. Using precious anti-aircraft shells to destroy tanks was strategically questionable, but it was tactically necessary. And it worked. By mid-1941, German doctrine had adapted. Commanders learned to deploy 88s in ambush positions, where Matildas would advance into prepared killing grounds. They would let British tanks bypass their forward positions, then engage from the flanks at long range, where the Matildas' slow speed made it unable to effectively respond. The tactic was effective but resource-intensive. It required intelligence, terrain knowledge, disciplined crews who could hold fire until the perfect moment, and enough 88s to make the ambush decisive. The Matildas' reign of invincibility was over, but the solution had come at a high cost for Germany, limiting their tactical flexibility and using up critical resources. The Matildas' shock value had profoundly altered the way every nation thought about tank design. Before the battles at Arras and in the Western Desert, armor thickness was often considered a secondary concern, something balanced against speed, cost, and firepower. After seeing the German panzers retreat from slow British tanks, that calculus changed overnight. Protection wasn't just useful, it was essential for survival. If your opponent fielded tanks that could resist your weapons, your own tanks were nothing more than mobile coffins. Germany responded quickly. By late 1940, orders went out to upgrade armor on all their tanks. The Panzer II, which had been the backbone of their armored divisions, received a 50mm gun to replace its inadequate 37mm gun. Frontal armor was increased from 30mm to 50mm, then to 70mm with applique plates. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support tank, was retrofitted with a long-barreled 75mm gun capable of engaging enemy armor at greater distances. By 1942, this gun could penetrate 90mm of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to take out a Matilda. But Germany didn't stop there. The experience with the Matilda and the Soviet KV-1 heavy tank convinced German high command that they had fundamentally misunderstood the armor race. Development accelerated on the Panzer V Panther and Panzer VI Tiger tanks, which carried 80 to 100mm of frontal armor and guns capable of destroying anything on tracks. The Tiger, which entered service in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun in a rotating turret with armor up to 120 cm thick. This was a direct response to tanks like the Matilda and the KV-1 that had humiliated German forces. Meanwhile, Britain learned different lessons. The Matilda had proven the infantry tank concept, but had also exposed its limitations. By 1941, the lack of high-explosive ammunition and the mechanical issues from the twin bus engines had become critical problems. More importantly, the desert campaigns showed that speed was more important than British doctrine had previously believed. Rommel's Africa Corps didn't sit still and absorb punishment. They maneuvered, flanked, and dictated the range of engagement. A tank that could only go 15 meters per charge couldn't pursue retreating enemies or escape difficult situations. The Churchill tank, which entered service in 1941, retained heavy armor but added a 75mm gun capable of firing high-explosive rounds and improved mobility. By 1942, Britain was shifting toward universal tanks, designs that balance protection, speed, and multi-purpose armament. The Matilda soldiered on in secondary theaters, especially in the Pacific, where Japanese anti-tank weapons were even weaker than the Italians. Australian crews used Matildas effectively through 1945 in New Guinea and Borneo, proving that context is as important as capability. Meanwhile, the Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, drew their own conclusions. The Sherman tank, which would eventually dominate Allied production, emphasized reliability, ease of production, and adequate protection rather than invincibility. American doctrine assumed they would lose tank-on-tank battles, but win through numbers, logistics, and combined arms. They weren't entirely wrong. The Sherman's weaknesses are well documented, but its 50,000 units proved far more valuable than a handful of complex and vulnerable heavy tanks. By 1943, the Matilda had become obsolete. German guns could easily penetrate its armor, and its slow speed was a liability in fluid warfare. Production ceased in August 1943 with roughly 2,900 units built. Yet its legacy lived on in every tank design meeting, where engineers debated armor thickness, and in every doctrine paper discussing protection versus mobility. The psychological scars it left on German veterans who watched their shells bounce off the Matildas would last long after the war. The British had built a tank that laughed at its enemies until they learned to stop laughing back.